Yeah, hi. So David Smith asked me to come along and talk about an experience that we had recently. Um, we had our Masters Labs research projects planned for June and July of this year. Clearly, that was the worst possible time to have a full lab cohort in the labs. Our university labs are still shut now. They were shut in March and they've been closed ever since. So we had to make some decisions. So I'm sharing the screen now. Hopefully you can all see it. I've got a very, very snappy title. I think you would agree. But basically, we very, very quickly had to change these labs around. We did it with a great deal of goodwill from the staff and some great will from the students as well. And I'm going to share with you the things that I think worked actually really well, considering the circumstances, and things that, given more time, I think we would run differently and do a little bit better. So our labs normally look like this. I'm sure that this is recognizable for you guys. Lots of students in relatively close quarters to one another, doing wet laboratory projects, using lots of different bits of equipment, sharing lab space, being a research community, really. And we very quickly realized that that wasn't going to be possible, but there were elements of that that we wanted to replicate. The problem we had was that the way our kind of lab projects, for the master's projects at least, is set up is that we have a series of modules that lead up to it. So we have some modules in trimester 1 before Christmas, a module in trimester 2 that is really very, very involved in preparing the students for their research projects. And then we offer the research projects through the summer. What that means is that we'd actually done all of the preparatory work, really, for the students to come and do a wet project. And so they'd done things like a literature review based on the subject of their projects. They'd worked up an experimental proposal. They'd started to think about risk assessing and ethical approvals, all these types of things. But the problem was, of course, that although we kept them in the same general scientific area, everyone who was doing a cancer biology project, for example, still got to do a cancer biology project, but it wasn't necessarily a project that was based on the same initial hypothesis. It wasn't the same as, certainly wasn't using the same techniques. And so our plans for how we were going to do the assessment and how we were actually going to run the projects had to change quite substantially. So people had gone from doing wet projects to doing things like analysis of pre-existing data sets. So we had a fair amount of transcriptomic data. We had people with lots of mass spectrometry data. And so they could work largely in the same area, but obviously it was more data analysis rather than actually generating the data for themselves. We had some people who moved completely into a new project altogether, again within the same discipline, but with a completely different focus. So we had people doing things like molecular dynamic simulations, 3D modeling, in silico drug discovery, these types of things. And none of that really fit with what they'd done previously. So we had to bear that in mind when we started up the projects and when we started to think about how we were going to assess the students. We had some people who didn't want to do that, and we gave students some agency, we gave students some choice over the types of projects. We didn't want them to feel like we were kind of imposing certain projects on them, although clearly it had to be within a certain envelope of the types of projects that we could offer. And so some students had to use big data that was in pre-existing databases, so things like GeneBank and other online databases. There are lots of different things that we did with them, kind of in a bioinformatics sense of processing that information. Probably the final big category, there are things that don't quite fall within these broad definitions, and there are things that kind of scan across multiple of these definitions. The last big grouping really was critical review. This was one of the bigger issues, I would say, during the project was both staff and student understanding of what systematic review really involves and how we approach that in a research context rather than simply just doing a literature review where we, collate and report on the information in the literature. And I'll come back on to that later on. Okay, so before we started, we realized that there was a variety of things that were going to be problematic for us. I'm going to go through these one at a time. So we had governance and quality issues. We had validation documents that were written and an assessment strategy that was devised based on the vast majority of our students being in the laboratory. and that needed to be revised because they were no longer going to be in the laboratory. Second big issue was research communities. We all know that research is a collaborative effort, and we were able to produce a pretty collaborative environment within the laboratories. We would sit people next to people who were working in the same area, using the same type of instrumentation, all these types of things. And that offers the students a great degree of peer support, and we didn't want to lose that. We wanted to kind of keep that research community idea, so we had to think about how we were going to do that. And then, of course, there was resourcing. So training and support for staff and students. You know, how do we get people up to speed with the new types of techniques that they're going to be using, often things they've never come across before? What sort of online tools could we gather together very, very quickly? What type of software could we either use on a web basis or that we could buy in? And how we were going to manage support networks, you know, across different subject areas, across different types of projects. First thing I should say is before we sorted out exactly what we were going to do, we did have various kind of periods of time where we're using things like Google Docs. We would contact the students and ask them for their preferences. So when we weren't sure if the labs were going to open or not, we would say, right, okay, would you be happy with a lab period that didn't run in June and July, but maybe ran in August and September? Would you be happy with a 4-week project instead of an 8-week project? Would you like to do a dry project right from the start? And one thing that we offered to students that around about a quarter of them elected to choose was to take a break and study. So was to basically come back in 12 months time, and hopefully by then they would be able to have an in-laboratory experience. We did explain to them that that certainly wasn't guaranteed, and I'm increasingly pessimistic that that will actually be the case now, but who can see the future, right? And yeah, so we offered them all of these things. In hindsight, I think that was well intentioned. I'm not sure it was the best thing to do because, of course, it creates the impression that there is something that we can control that would have offered them a laboratory experience, and which in the end turned out not to be the case. And we had to effectively say, look, the only option remaining is either do a dry project now or take a break and study and come back and see where we are in a year. Okay. So after we did that, then we had to start planning very quickly, very short period of time of what we were going to do in terms of delivery and assessment. And the good news for us was that our learning outcomes were very much research focused rather than focused on a laboratory experience. So the vast majority of these learning outcomes were actually achievable, whether it was a laboratory project or a non-laboratory project. The only one that caused us a little bit of grief was the final one, which was communicate effectively verbally in a written report on your project. Because we decided quite early on that we were going to get rid of the Viva assessment element within our module because of the logistic challenges, the IT facilities that were available to students. Our Vivas took the form of a presentation followed by a traditional Viva with a supervisor and a second examiner. And we decided that we didn't want to do that because of the organisational challenges associated with it. But we had to conform with our learning outcomes. It's part of our validation documents, so we had to think of a way around that. So this was our original assessment package, and you can see two problems with that based on what I just said. The first is that 20% of the marks were allocated to lab skills. They're not going to be in the lab anymore. So we had to think about what we were going to do with that. And the third task was the Viva, which, as I've already said, we wanted to replace. So what we decided to do was to completely change our assessment package. We keep the written report, and we increased the weighting of this. Actually, in retrospect, I'm not sure we needed to do that quite so starkly. I think I would have probably gone for a 60-40 split or something like that now, but I was worried with the thing that we were replacing the lab skills and the Viva with, which is what we call the research progress portfolio, would be too lightweight to justify the amount of credit associated with it. This is a 60 credit module, so we had to be kind of cognizant of kind of quality issues. However, actually, now that the pieces of work have been handed in, actually the research progress portfolios are quite a substantial piece of work. And I'm going to change the screen that I'm sharing with you now and show you the portfolio that we put together. So essentially, students would meet frequently in research groups, and I'm going to explain those research groups in a second. And each week, after completing a week's worth of research and attending their research group meeting, having the opportunity to talk to their peers and to staff, to supervisors of other related projects, that they would put something like this together. And so for each week, they would fill out these boxes. So they would describe the techniques they've used, the skills that they've developed, how they contributed to and interacted with the research group, and how all of those things fed into them adapting their experimental plan or their strategy for developing meaningful data out of their research projects. And so actually this ended up being quite a lengthy document for each student, and actually, was of a pretty high quality for the ones that I've seen so far. So I think my concerns about this being a kind of lighter touch assessment were unfounded once we actually saw it in practice. But we had 2 weeks to plan it, so I wasn't going to get everything right. Okay, so back on this then. So all of this kind of relied then on having these research communities. The research progress portfolio wouldn't work at all if the student was only speaking with their supervisor. I think that can become quite a narrow relationship anyway. I think some students can end up being led very much by the hand by the supervisor and lack the confidence sometimes to kind of demonstrate their own independence, propose their own ideas and develop their own research strategies. And clearly that's something that we want evidence that the students are doing. And so having this broader community, really helped with their confidence and really it helped with the projects as well. And speaking from my own experience with my own project student under this circumstance, we were using a certain series of bioinformatic tools where we were looking at transcriptomic data and thinking about how this affected kind of whole gene systems, when you changed one parameter. And there was a bit of software I wasn't aware of, which related to gene neighborhoods. And this came out because another student was using it, another supervisor spoke to us about how we might integrate that into our experimental plan, and it enhanced the project no end. So each of these research groups then were split into around about 8 to 12 students. This was a nice sized group. Everyone got to know each other very well. And depending on how many students each staff member was supervising, we had between 4 and 8 staff as well. Each supervisor for our master's program supervises between 1 and 3 students. And so that's how we ended up with these numbers. To help the external examiners and to ensure fair moderation across all of the tasks, the moderators for the projects of individual supervisors were deliberately included within the same research group. So all of the presentations that the students did, all of their contributions to the research group were seen not only by their supervisor, who was going to be one of the markers, but also by their moderator, who was going to second mark both of their pieces of work. And so it allowed us to kind of have a fair mechanism for making sure that we had appropriate marks across the piece. These research groups met once a week on Zoom. Each student would present formally at least twice. So our projects were 8 weeks long. If we had 8 to 12 students, we'd have 2 or 3 students talking each week, and they would do one presentation near the start of their projects, talking about the background, how they developed that hypothesis and what their experimental plan was. And then a second presentation later on, where they were describing some of the results that they've generated, how they were interpreting it, and what that means for developing their experimental plans further. All of these activities, as I said before, were logged on that research progress portfolio. In addition to the formal presentations though, every student just gave a kind of quick 1-minute roundup of what they've been doing each week, and everyone within the group was given an opportunity to ask questions. The really important thing from these research groups, as far as I'm concerned, is having an effective chair for each of the groups. I think personally, and this is the way that we did it, that it should be someone not too senior. I do worry that if Professor Megagrant is running a research group, then that creates a kind of fear factor and a degree of intimidation to the students, which may make them a little less forthcoming. And I'm sure not all Professor Megagrants are like this, but some Professor Megagrants would be a little bit more exacting and a little less forgiving for maybe some of the students that are at the lower end of the kind of attainment scale in terms of what they were able to achieve, particularly given that they had very little time to plan for their own projects prior to actually starting them as well. So we tended to have more junior members of staff, and they acted more as facilitators rather than, you know, a judge or something like that. And we find that that worked quite well. The feedback from the students was very good about these research communities, and most of the groups had a nice, friendly dynamic. Okay, training is probably the most challenging thing that we had to do. Our department is largely filled with laboratory-based researchers. We are largely practical lab-based scientists. Many of us, myself most definitely included, had to think very, very hard about what we could offer in a dry project. I had to learn a whole raft of new bits of software and read a considerable amount of literature to get me up to speed on the sorts of things that I was going to have to be delivered. Some people work on big data type things anyway, and some people have bioinformatic experience, and for them I think it was much easier. And I think where you can, I think it's very important that you identify these people as early as possible and ask them to help with the training processes. We had a very, very helpful group who put together a lot of online resources in a very short period of time, and that was really gratefully received. But you need to get the right people, the people that you can trust, the people that have the relevant skills, and then try and use them as well as yourselves to bring the more resistant members of staff with you. I personally had more issues with staff than I had with students in the transition from wet projects to dry projects, with some members of staff in the first instance just telling me, well, they couldn't do dry projects, that it was my problem, that I had to go away and sort something out. But we can't staff even the number of projects in the master's cohort, and there's certainly not going to be that flexibility with our undergraduate projects when they come in later in the year. So trying to kind of gently bring resistant staff along, I think, is a really important thing to do, and understand that many staff won't have done these types of projects before, and that they need training, they need resources, they need support. I think often universities and departments become very, very student focused, and of course students should be our first priority. But when you're having to change your whole kind of teaching methodology in a very, very short period of time, that can be incredibly stressful for staff as well. And I think having the right training and the right support is really, really important there. So we organised some core training, so obviously, you know, the module leader, which was me, explained to the students how everything was going to work, how it was going to be assessed, what the differences were going to be from what they'd been prepared for what they were going to move on to. And that was compulsory for all students. Likewise, we had to reconsider our ethics, and so we had to do that as well. And so that was core for every student. We then broke the training down based on a variety of factors. So some of it was broken down by subject discipline. So there was specific training for people on our microbiology masters, for example, and different training for students on our chemistry routes. And then there was stuff that was technique specific. So this may be students that are across different cohorts. So they may be in a microbiology masters or a cancer biology masters, but actually they're looking at transcriptomic data, and so we can train them based on technique. The research groups that I mentioned before were all set up based on subject discipline. So no matter what type of project you were doing, if you were on the cancer biology MSc, if you were doing a cancer critical review project, if you were doing a cancer big data project, a cancer drug modeling project, you were all put in the same group. And actually having that diversity of projects we found was very helpful and helped maintain the interest levels rather than having similar talks on similar techniques every single week. But those groups where we have students with overlapping techniques that are not in the same research groups also needed resources made available to them. And so we created groups on Google Communities, on Blackboard Collaborate, and we set up specific training sessions and discussion groups on Blackboard. We created a whole raft of things that students could use. All of our training had to be online. The university was shut. There was no rooms, there was no labs, there was no computer labs, there was nothing. So everything had to move online. Some students had better Wi-Fi connections than others. Some students had better computing facilities than others. And this was very, very challenging as well. We also created a kind of self-service database of online tools and resources. I can show you that, well, give you an example of that at least. I'll share a different screen. If I can find it. Why is it not there? Oh, I know why. Okay, I can't share that with you. Sorry, because I opened the Zoom search, I wasn't able to keep this at the right tab on my browser, but I can show that to anyone after this talk if they're interested. But basically we had kind of things like Oxford run a thing called the Evidence-Based Medicine Centre. The Evidence-Based Medicine Centre has loads of tools in there that can be used for free on things like systematic review, on things like how to appraise the literature objectively, how you look at clinical trials data, these types of things. We had lots of our kind of online platforms put on there as well. So we put things like Panther for gene clustering. We put a link to that. We put links to basically more software than anyone would ever actually need to use. And we tried to organize it as best we can by subject discipline or by technique. Probably the biggest challenge was the diversity of projects. We had loads of different types of projects, as I've already described, and these were based on all sorts of different things. So supervisors' research area or their experience and skills, and what the students wanted to do and whether we could actually do it. I mean, there were some types of software that was just prohibitively expensive. We obviously had a consumables budget put in place for the wet labs, and we were able to use that to buy limited licenses or broad licenses associated with the types of projects we would like to do, but certain things were just beyond our reach. I mean, it's the same as with instrumentation, I suppose, in the laboratory. As I said, we kept our research groups based on research discipline rather than the individual techniques that they were using. So in summary then, so what worked well? Well, I thought the research groups were a really big success. I'm going to keep them. So if we're back in the lab next summer, if we're half in the lab, half out of the lab next summer, or we're fully virtual again, I'm keeping the research groups. I thought they worked really, really well. Supervisors seemed to get a lot out of it. Students seemed to really enjoy them. And I think the projects were better as a consequence of it. I think the quality of the research that was done was enhanced by having that periodic peer review process built in. So I'd definitely be keeping those. I think our resources database was pretty good. I know that David has organised the Dry Labs resource database, and myself and David were kind of producing parallel databases for a period of time. And then I started nicking things from the Dry Labs one, and I don't know if David nicked anything off our list to put on this list. But you know, having those databases was invaluable and saved so much time. I think the use of multiple online platforms and tools was actually really good. You know, not every platform has its own limitations and its own benefits in terms of how you use it. A Google community is great for discussions, but it's probably not particularly good at kind of systematically organizing training sessions. Other things, you know, lack the connectivity that Google communities have. So there are benefits and disadvantages to everything. The fact that we were able to use certain web-based platforms for a lot of the kind of research stuff was really good. And, you know, the fact that we were able to buy standalone licenses for bits of software was helpful as well. So what didn't work so well? Module continuity was a problem. Students felt like some of the stuff that they did in the second semester module was now a waste of time. We tried to persuade them that despite the fact that the activity they undertook no longer related specifically to their own project, learning how to do kind of experimental planning, learning how to evaluate health and safety risks, learning how to consider the ethical issues of a project was all good stuff that would stand them in good stead. But there was some disgruntlement because of the way in which it went. As I mentioned before, in silico capacity is a real big problem. You know, the cost of certain software platforms, the accessibility of certain things to students. If you're doing molecular dynamic simulations and you're doing it on something with a slow clock speed processor, then you can get a couple of nanoseconds of data, which is not particularly useful. There's also a disconnect between what is useful for certain students. I mean, thankfully, many of our students are gamers, and so their graphical processing units were often quite good. So for things like modeling, you know, that was good news for us, but not all students are gamers. Some of them had computers with very fast processors, but no standalone graphics cards, which meant certain types of experiments were either impossible or very, very limited in their usage. You'll notice that this is in both columns. Some students found some difficulty in switching between the different platforms to get the different bits of information. There's always been a big drive at our university to kind of have a degree of consistency. And I understand that, and I agree with that for the most part. I think, though, when you're conducting research, I think there has to be an acceptance that different platforms are going to be more appropriate for different types of outcomes. But some of our students didn't get on so well with that, and maybe that's something we need to look at in terms of training for future iterations. The training schedule. This was more of a function of the time frame we had rather than our wishes for what would happen. So we wanted to run everything as organized a fashion as possible, but we had 3 weeks. So I think the core stuff was pretty well organized, but pretty much everything else was done on an ad hoc basis. And that meant, you know, there were communication issues, there were students who missed certain sessions. And I think if you have a lead into your project, a very good use of your time would be to think very carefully about how you're going to schedule training, how you're going to target it towards certain students and certain staff members, and how you're going to communicate that effectively. Final thing, and this I've put across both because we don't have the results yet. The things are all in, but the marks deadline isn't for another 10 days. Someone out the Vivas for a more community-based oral assessment. I like how it ran, but I don't know how it's going to end up in terms of the effect on attainment. I actually personally think that the environment in which the presentations and the oral contributions regarding the development of their projects in the research communities was better, less stressful for the students. They were more relaxed, so they're more confident, they were more likely to do well than in that kind of acute examination viva voce type environment. But we'll have to see. I'll let you guys know in a couple of weeks if you're interested. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions or comments, and very much best of luck for converting all of your projects. I wouldn't want to be doing it for an undergraduate cohort, so Godspeed to all of you who are.
Excellent, brilliant, thank you, Keith. I know the process you've been through because we're at the same university, and the module continuity you're talking about is my module to your module.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to put you on the spot, David.
Right, I can comment on that if anybody wants to, but there are some questions in the chat for you. If anybody would like to ask Keith a question, either speak up or put it into the chat to begin with. But Nigel asked, and you sort of answered this, do you have any feedback from the students about their feelings on the experience, how the students got on with it?
Yeah, so I mean, another benefit of having the weekly research group meetings was that we were pretty much constantly getting feedback from the students directly. And as me running the module, and I also chaired one of the research groups, I was also getting feedback from the chairs of the other research groups. For the most part, the students were actually incredibly understanding. I think they realized that we were in a very difficult situation. We had to make changes at very short order. As I said, there are some grumbles about one or two things. I suspect some of the students who were grumbling would have grumbled no matter what the circumstances were. But some of them had very valid points. And where we could affect it, where we could change, you know, how we organize our online tools, how we could change how we organize our training schedules, communication with supervisors, we did it within the module. But there are certain things that weren't within our gift, really, in the time frame that we had, but that we will definitely take forward to future years. So things like, you know, how do students gain access to software, for example? If they went and did some reading, they identified some tools they would like to use, and they weren't freeware on a web-based platform, how did they get to do that? Obviously, they speak to the supervisor. The supervisors didn't necessarily know how to do that either, because again, this is not something we would normally do. And so it then comes to me. I then speak with the technical team and the IT services. It was a very long process. It was a lengthy chain, and we're very much looking at ways in which we can shorten that chain if we need to do this again in the future.
So that I was going to ask you a question about around model continuity, and it's not a leading question because I know I have to do it. If knowing what you know now, what would you like to have had the students prepared for this type of project?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context to everybody else, because David and I know what we do. So we train them on various elements. So in the past, our master's research projects were written up like a kind of long format lab report, and with quite a lengthy introduction, which was really a literature review and various other tasks. We wanted to move away from that, and this year was supposed to be the first year where we would have a kind of research article style submission. But unfortunately, we had to go back to the old model because the literature review that we'd had them do was no longer relevant to their own project, and so we had to extend the background thing. So what I would do if we were doing it from scratch, starting with a dry project, is I would do some training early doors on objective appraisal of the literature. So that's using things like journal quartiles, looking at impact factors, thinking about the provenance of the authors, looking at the prior outputs of the research group, these types of things, thinking about using different types of grading scales for examining what best evidence is. So things like using JADAD scoring, for example, if you were looking at clinical trials data, basically training students on evidence-based inquiry. In addition to that, I would try and allocate projects as early as possible, try and figure out exactly what techniques were going to be used by each student, and bring in things like bioinformatic and other types of online tool training prior to the start of projects, so that they had a good feel for, okay, what can be done, where can I get database resources, where can I get online tools from, and I would release that database of online tools and resources to the students as early as possible.
Excellent. Thanks, Keith. This leads into an open question for everybody who's in the room. It says, what do we think the student expectations of the projects are this year? Are they expecting access to some wet labs, or are the majority still undertaking dry projects? So that was a question from Ian, firstly to Keith and then to everybody. So do we think the students coming in this year are going to be thinking, oh, definitely it's all wet labs, great, or are they now knowing they're moving into a dry lab situation?
I mean, I can answer from a Sheffield Hallam perspective.
Yeah, do it from yours first, and then we'll open it to everybody, and then we'll close that round of question. Yes, for you first, Keith.
So I think students. I mean, I've spoken to some of my final year students already, and I think they're quite realistic about the fact that they won't be in labs full time all week during their projects. I think they still expect that they're going to get some laboratory time, and I think that's still the aspiration of the university as well. So I think it'll be more of a blended approach. And I think for a lot of projects, that'll work great. If you're doing modeling stuff and then you can test some of the outcomes of that model in the laboratory a couple of days a week, then I think that's a really nice project. And the students, I think, will be able to see the genuine researchness of it. Because I think some of that was the challenge, where particularly for people who are doing things like systematic reviews in a fully dry environment, was that they somehow didn't see that methodological approach, that statistical analysis, was as valid as if they were generating wet data in a laboratory.
Brilliant. And any comments from anybody else in the room on that? What do you think your students might be expecting? And this is where you get the deathly wall of silence. You can use a chat box if you like. And lots of people already have, by the way. There's questions in there.
I'll jump in on that, David. Swansea.
Silence for me.
We're looking at a kind of hybrid approach. So we're trying to divide final year project students up that want to do a wet lab project by supervisor, who will then have to try and organise a rota within their lab. The likelihood is they will all be working on some kind of group project and gaining different elements of that group project so they can combine it at the end. Because we just don't have the capacity to have huge numbers in the labs, as is probably the same with every single institution. So hybrid approach and doing the best that we can to provide some sort of experience for students as and how we can.
Okay, sounds like hybrid might be the thing for us to explore going forward. All right, well, I am conscious time. Thank you very much for that, Keith. It's good to see what can be done. Just for the record, Keith has already written a how-to guide on systematic reviews that's on the Lecture Remotely site that you can go look at that after the event.